Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Borrie, and kia ora, as we say in New Zealand. I'm the program lead for WMD and other strategic weapons at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. And I'm really pleased to welcome you today to this second in the series of Launchpad seminars that UNIDIR has organized with our partners, the Secure World Foundation, and the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique, FRS, Paris. Now, people are connected all over the world to this virtual seminar, and it's something of an experiment for us. Hopefully, we'll have a smooth sailing today in terms of our technical things. But of course, something like this event is really only made possible by global satellite communications, and in particular, digital transmission of data through cyber and real space. But there are risks to this. And today we'll be discussing cyber warfare in space, what it is, what it means, and what might be done about it. So just before we move on to introducing our speaker and our respondent today, I'd just like to make a couple of announcements which will make the meeting go more smoothly. The purpose of this meeting is to provide an informal virtual platform to keep discussing space security issues. The event's being recorded. The event will be in English only. But just to all of you coming in as participants in this meeting, if you can please make sure that you keep your microphones muted and your cameras switched off. There are literally hundreds of people joining this meeting. So if you're all just making a tiny bit of noise, it's going to quickly become quite overwhelming. And if you want to find those controls, just move your mouse if you're using a computer, and you'll see a row of round buttons show up at the bottom center of your screen. And you'll see on the left-hand side, you have a microphone and sort of movie camera icons. And if you hover over there, those, it will tell you whether you're muted or unmuted or not. So if you can make use of those, that would be really good. We also have the ability to ask questions and to gather your responses through a multimedia viewer. And some of you may have already participated in a poll that we've had running for the last few minutes. If you aren't aware of how to use that, again, go to the round buttons on your screen, and then second from the right, you'll see a round button with 3 breadcrumbs on it. If you click on that, a window will come up, and you'll see at the top left, you'll see probably in blue something that says multimedia viewer. So if you click on that, then that will bring up another window where you can see more information and you can submit your answers. And that'll be quite useful because we're going to be using this a couple of times in the course of today's 1 hour meeting. Just a couple of other things. We'll be sending out a link for evaluations of this meeting in the next day or two. So you'll be able to share your thoughts on what we've done right, what we've done wrong, and maybe how we can improve for further meetings. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this event on cyber warfare in space. And I'm really pleased today that we have 2 great panelists. We have Dr. Beyza Unal, who's a Senior Research Fellow with the International Security Department at Chatham House. And she's also the author of a very interesting report on cybersecurity of NATO's space-based strategic assets. It was published last year. And she's also done a lot of work looking at cyber and nuclear command and control. Now, other panelists today is Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan from the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And Raji is very knowledgeable in this area. And in fact, just last year for UNIDIR, we published a paper by her on electronic and cyber warfare in outer space. And you can find that on UNIDIR's website at www.unidir.org. But now I'm going to pass over to Beyza for a few minutes to talk to us. What is a cyber attack, and how does that translate to space? Do these have unique features, as somebody asked from China before the meeting? And why do strategic military systems depend on space-based assets? So Beyza, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I think just before getting into what is a cyber attack, it's important to start with the understanding of the idea of space warfare, and then I'll just take the audience to the cyber part, if you don't mind. I think the whole idea of space warfare, when we look at it, has been in a way romanticized, I call it, for decades now. And both in the film industry and also in political decision making, we see that romanticization. Please move to image one. And the focus in that regard has always been given on the physical elements of space warfare, and not much attention actually was given to the cyber elements, up until recently, I would say. The reason why cyber became an important element of the discussion is, I believe, in threefold. We can move to the second image. The first reason, I would say, is that space technology, if you look at it, relies on digitalization. And that the digitalization also is at the heart of the cyber technology. And when you talk about the digitalization always comes with certain potential cyber vulnerabilities. By exploiting cyber vulnerabilities, an adversary can be able to take remote control of a satellite, for instance. And I see that one of the members of the audience put that into the question that you've asked. They can jam satellite signals, they can spoof associated data to those satellites and so on. So what we're really fearing of is the integrity, the reliability, and the confidentiality of data to be lost due to cyber interferences. The second important part of this is that space technology is, when you look at it, is integrated throughout the critical national infrastructure. And that dependency, I think, is critical. We can move to the third image, please. In the third image, you can see that I pointed out a number of critical national infrastructure that actually uses space and space technologies. Take energy sector, for example. Space data is fundamental, it's critical for oil and gas pipeline monitoring purposes. Or if you look at the financial sector, you will see that the GNSS services are important for timestamps that record the timing of the completion of a transaction. Why critical national infrastructure is linked to the weapon systems, in my mind, is that in conflict time, the critical national infrastructure will be vulnerable as well. So when we talk about warfare in space, we do not actually think only about what's happening up in space, but we also need to think about the whole ground segment, the Earth, what's going to happen on the Earth segment as well. Moreover, I would say that the third point is that strategic weapon systems depend on the space technology. Defense sector, for instance, heavily relies on all aspects of space services. And I would say that most of the dependency probably relies on the PNT service. The PNT service is the service mainly the application comes from the GPS and the GNSS utilization. If you think about strategic weapon systems and how they depend on the space technology, per your question, John, weapon systems generally use space technology for the space services that are highlighted in this slide. As I mentioned, PNT is one of them. PNT provides, for instance, synchronization of military operations, or they support targeting operations to track forces and assets. Environmental monitoring, for instance, is generally the one that most of the time is forgotten, but submarines rely on weather information, which is the environmental monitoring, or weather information is actually important in any kind of military operation. You need to know the speed of the wind, you need to know whether it's a cloudy day or a rainy day or a sunny day, and so on. And all of these services, we rely on space. We can move to image 4. In fact, there is kind of growing dependency of the use of space technology in military operations. in this image, you can see that during the first Gulf War, the space dependency was around 10%. And when you look at the war in Afghanistan and the Iraq war, you will see that this has increased fundamentally to 60% to the 65% respectively. What I mean by space dependency is the utilization, the reliance on precision-guided munitions in operations, in military operations. And these are numbers come from official sources, UK parliamentary studies, and so on. So what I can say is that then the reliance on space technology is only going to increase in the future. It would be naive to expect a type of decrease that will happen in here. We need to realize that the future warfare is going to be hybrid in nature. And this probably doesn't mean that warfare will take place in space in physical sense. But it means, in my mind, that space services and products will be fundamental in any military operation and for assuring that mission assurance in a way and in national security. And in the last, I think, part that I would like to raise, please move to image 6. It is important actually to protect space assets from cyber attacks. And it is fundamental to do so, and there are ways to achieve this. The way that I look at it is it's threefold. We need to think about mitigation measures. In my mind, these are cultural and technical measures that could be addressed. We need to think about adaptation measures, which involves, in a way, adapting to the new contested or denied operating environment for the military. And thirdly, and most importantly, we need to think about resilience measures, which probably is more about what type of future-proof solutions that we need to rely on to protect space assets. Only when, I think, we are able to provide resilience in the space segment against cyber attacks, the adversary will be deterred at the very beginning. That's how I think I would put it, John, in 5 minutes.
Well, thanks very much, Beyza. There's a lot in what you've just said, and it'd be interesting just to unpack some of these ideas. And Raji, how do cyber means of attack differ from electronic means of attack? Just quickly, because that may not be altogether clear to everyone. And I guess who's got these capabilities? I mean, have we seen many openly acknowledged or verified incidents of cyber operations against satellites, rather, space objects? I know that you've been following these things and you've written about them. Do you want to share with us what you know?
Thank you, John, and thank you, Beyza. I think there was a fascinating overview of the kind of cyber warfare that takes place in outer space, given out a lot of facts and sort of numbers to kind of say how dependent the militaries around the world are on cyber and space, the interlink and interface, so on and so forth. That's terrific, but I think it's also kind of important to kind of see where we are heading, and I think that's where it's also kind of important to look at the kind of differentiation between, for instance, John asked the question, what's the difference between the electronic warfare and the cyber attacks, so to say. Electronic warfare essentially uses the radio frequency energy to interfere with or jam communications to and from satellites, but they do not cause physical damage. Whereas cyber technologies use an entire range of software, network techniques, to compromise, control, interfere with, or destroy certain systems and linked to satellite operations. But I think it's, again, the more these our space systems are linked to cyber nodes, the greater the vulnerabilities and gaps there are, in a sense. There have been many openly acknowledged and verified, some incidents that have been verified, but I think there are a number of countries that are developing these capabilities. Generally to have to engage in cyber capabilities, cyber warfare against non-space objects and targets as of now. But I think against outer space assets, there have been a few incidents that have been verified so far, because I think that's a critical aspect in terms of how how reliable are some of the information available in open sources in a sense. So in one of the, I think, earlier incidents, I think sometime in 2007 and 2008, there were 2 US satellites that were compromised through a ground station in Norway. This again was done through via internet, was traced to China. The severity of the attack, particularly in the case of the 2008 attack, is particularly alarming because the hackers were able to achieve all the steps required to command a satellite, although there was no harm done to it. So in that sense, I do think, and I argue that many countries have been testing out their capabilities to see the feasibility of engaging in the cyber operations against space assets. Then in 2014, there was a US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration NOAA satellite that was hacked. Again, no data was compromised, but again, the published news reports talked about the origin of this particular attack in China. In October 2018, NASA was hacked, where again, social security numbers as well as personal data of former as well as current employees, NASA employees, were found compromising. There have also been a group of Russian-speaking hackers with possible links to the Russian government who have been reported to be using malware named Tala for attacks on communication satellites. So there have been a number of incidents that have come to light. Some of these have been verified. At least these few have been verified, but there are a number of incidents that have been reported to be happening on the cyber outer space front. A whole range of other countries, including Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, have developed significant cyber warfare capabilities, but they have been mostly tested against non-space assets at this point of time.
Thanks, Raji. So, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, it really signals that we're not dealing with science fiction here. This stuff is going on, and it's been going on for some time. What's also been going on for some time, I see, is we have quite a lot of questions flowing in from the audience, which is fantastic. So I'm gonna send a few of them your way, Raji and Beyza. To the audience, I'll have to be completely honest with you. I don't think we'll get through all the questions that we're being asked to today. We only have an hour, but we'll try to get through as many as we can. And if you do feel like including your name or where you're from in your question, we're happy to read that out too. But just a couple of quick questions for you, Beyza. One person was asking, you were talking about levels of space dependency in your presentation. Somebody was just asking where that data came from. And also, there was a question about commercial space actors and whether these actors are more vulnerable to hacking than militaries. And I guess that links to something else, which I think would be really interesting to hear from you, Beyza, in view of your work looking at NATO. And you pointed out in your report on NATO that NATO doesn't own any space assets of its own. It uses the assets of its member alliance states, but then that can create issues of its own in terms of the coordination between those different actors. And does that create any strategic vulnerabilities, or is that a good thing? Does that increase resilience? So while you answer that, I'll ask Raji to mull over a question that I've got here. Could cyber operations in space contribute to conflict escalation? So Beyza, over to you first.
Okay, thank you very much, John. I think I mentioned about on the first question about the space dependency numbers. A few studies, one of them is the UK parliamentary study. They are all cited in the report that you've also pointed out in the 2019 report that we published. They can find those numbers there as well if they're interested in it. The second question on commercial space actors, whether they are more vulnerable to hacking, that's an interesting and an important question. It really depends on probably whether the commercial sector or the organizations are actually being on top with their cyber maturity, I would say. And partially it also links back to how much military actually relies on commercial companies and space products and services from commercial companies. The numbers actually are increasing every year. Even in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, I can't remember over the top of my head right now, but I know that the United States actually relied on commercial companies during the operations. Now, saying that, in my discussions with NATO officials on this, is that even when NATO uses and relies on commercial companies, there are certain checks that they need to do before commissioning the company to go ahead and give the data or any type of services to them. And also they talk about certain level of hardening of the systems, the commercial systems, and making them in a way coming to the military terms. But of course, this depends on who, right? If it is a company that completely works on space technologies and invest on space technologies and have the budget to implement cyber requirements and baseline requirements that NATO asks, that's perfect. But sometimes what we see in the commercial sector is that there are small companies that they just come for one specific objective. And once that objective is done in 2-3 years' time, they just either go away or they start to focus on something else. If the company closes off, then the question is who is accountable for any type of breach that might happen during the longer duration of that service that NATO or any other kind of country is going to use that service for. And I think that's partially important to realize. I wouldn't say whether commercial companies are more vulnerable or not. I wouldn't answer yes directly, but I would say countries at least are trying to create some baseline requirements when they use commercial sector. I think in the last point that you raised on the alliance, I think you said the alliance does not have their own satellites, and does this create additional vulnerabilities in terms of cyber hacking? That's an interesting question as well, because we debated on this subject a lot with some, again, officials, and the officials are rightly pointing out, saying that, well, NATO does not have many capabilities. It's not only the satellites, in other areas also NATO doesn't have capabilities. So it's not actually fair. They say that it's not fair to say NATO space capability comes at the discretion of its member states. And probably it's true. But the problem with the space assets is that when that discretion comes from the member states, you rely on the implementation procedures, the baseline requirements that member states is putting on. And as NATO, you do not have much saying in that regard, whether those services or the products are secure or not. And I think that is probably going to be a big problem in the long run, if not right now, because in NATO right now, probably we're talking about 8 to 9 countries that actually have high space capability and a role in space. But the whole member states, I mean, the whole structure is 30 states. In the long run, that is going to probably affect. I'll turn to Raji, perhaps.
Hi. Thank you, John, for that question. Whether it's cyber operations in space, whether it contributes to conflict escalation. That's a very interesting question, but it's also a difficult question to answer because it's not very clear as to how things accelerate and kind of pick up the pace. I think there are a couple of important questions to be answered before one can get to the conflict escalation point. For instance, what should be the criteria for deciding that a cyber attack has taken place in the first instance? Because you also need to build consensus among states on this particular question, and that's not going to be easy. And it's also likely that most states would agree that an attack has happened if it leads to physical destruction for them to see, or even cause fatality of individuals and so on and so forth. But it's going to be a lot more difficult to reach an agreement on this question when there is nothing that you can see in clear terms as to what kind of damage has happened. And especially if it becomes even more challenging when a state or a private industry that has been engaged in this endeavor has used cyber measures only for tampering or testing out of feasibility, or even for stealing data, and that particular interference has not resulted in any physical destruction of assets, it becomes a lot more difficult. But clearly, there are ways to do it. For instance, unauthorized access generally is considered a crime. But again, whether it would amount to international aggression, that's somewhat problematic and possibly a point of disagreement among the number of states. And that, in fact, is a sign of the larger problem that you see in the outer space domain, which is to build consensus among states. So finding that agreement among all the different states in terms of what has happened and how do we go about it and so on and so forth, I think that's going to be extremely challenging in a sense. So it's unclear as to how you can determine that first and foremost an attack has happened, and how do you respond to it, and can you actually call for sort of a conflict escalation? Can you foresee conflict escalation? I think that's a separate challenge because of the agreement that you need to build among different states.
Thanks very much, Raji. What we're going to try to do under the discussion over the next few minutes is actually to put another question out to the audience using our Mentimeter feature of the multimedia viewer. And you'll see a slide on your screen. Does a hack qualify as an attack on a satellite? Yes, no, or maybe. So again, if you go to the round button on your screen with the three breadcrumbs, you'll find your multimedia viewer there, and you can bring up a window in which you'll be able to put your answers. We can already see maybe and yes. Yes is doing very well. We'll continue to keep that open for a few minutes, but I want to ask a couple more questions to our panelists. We're getting a lot of questions coming in. A lot of them relating to sort of broader strategic things such as nuclear deterrence and so forth, and these are probably quite difficult questions to answer. I had a very interesting question here, though, from one of our colleagues from Dimitri Stevanovic. He's asking, are there any capabilities for cyber and electronic warfare attacks using space assets against ground infrastructure? Maybe that's one for you, Raji, if you want to take that on. And
sure.
Got some question. I'll just queue up a question here for Beyza to think about as well. We're seeing these sort of new technologies like AI and machine learning and cube satellites, for example, cheap small satellites that can be launched in large constellations. What kind of impact are these sort of likely to have? Will they increase resilience, for instance, against cyber attacks, or will they make cyber attacks easier in the case of AI or machine learning? Has there been any thought about that? So that'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say. But Raji, over to you first.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Dimitri, for that question. I think I don't think we have too many incidents where we have seen attacks on ground infrastructure. Mostly this has been on satellites. And in a sense, even for instance, I can give you how the ground operations have been sort of affected. I think there are a number of incidents to show that. For instance, in 2010-12 period, I think North Korea, for instance, was using GPS spoofing of the South Korea's GPS signals for days at a stretch, and thereby affecting their flights, ships, and even personal devices. But I haven't come across really situations, or there have been several number of other incidents, but again, none of them have been, in a sense, attacking the ground stations asset. Mostly these have been either satellite communication satellites, or GPS and so on and so forth. GPS have been particularly the most attractive sort of an option target for a lot of for a number of countries or private individuals, hackers who have been engaged in this exercise. But none so far that have actually targeted ground. At least no confirmed reports to suggest the hacking of ground stations, for instance. But number of incidents involving the attack on satellites that have in turn affected ground operations.
Raji, can I just ask a quick follow-up to that from Tom Hickey, one of our colleagues at UNIDIR?
Yeah.
He asks, I think it's a good question because it's not necessarily, I think, obvious to our audience. I mean, what are the advantages or disadvantages of using cyber capabilities against satellites compared with other counter space capabilities? I mean, can't you just shoot them down with ASAT interceptors or use lasers or something like that? Why use cyber?
Sure. No, I think that's a great question. In fact, I think Daniel Porras from UNIDIR and I did a paper long ago on looking at the cyber outer space interface in a sense for the Observer Research Foundation. But again, we were kind of looking at that particular point to see that, okay, there have not been, despite, for instance, the return of the ASAT with the Chinese conducted one of the first successful satellite ASAT test in 2007, you still did not see too many other countries following that path. And that was a good thing because anti-satellites are one, they are inherently destabilizing in many ways. Second, the amount of long-lasting space debris that they produce, I think that's a much larger problem when you look at the space security, but also the long-term sustainability of outer space. Those are much bigger challenges. Whereas cyber is a much more attractive option because anybody who can jamming up sort of a device or a hacking option, you don't need a whole lot of expertise, and these things are available for a couple of $100 on the internet. You can buy these things, so it's much easier to use the cyber option as against even lasers. Lasers, again, it's not things are available, but we have not seen too many people, too many countries, too many players going down this path. So yeah, we haven't seen too many states or even other players using lasers at this point of time. There are instances of use, but it's been still limited. But using cyber, it's cheaper, it's easier to produce, easier to procure. It's much more, and the biggest attraction with regard to cyber option is that it gives you the deniability option. You can conduct a cyber act, engage in a cyber act, and deny that of your role and responsibility in that particular attack in a sense. So it does give you a huge amount of advantages when it comes to cyber options, which are not necessarily available with other kinetic or even other sort of lasers and other such options.
Thanks, Raji. That's a really nice segue, I think, into the question for Beyza. And Beyza, while you're answering, I'm just going to ask our producers if they might be able to bring up the slide again with the results of the poll while you're talking. So over to you.
Yes, so what I would probably say that the emerging technologies are an opportunity and a curse at the same time when you think about protecting space assets. There are a number of opportunities that comes with emerging technology that I think it's important to focus on. For instance, the dimension on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Cyber intrusion detections, for instance, can be done through artificial intelligence and machine learning applications. And I think there has been some work going on in that regard, not in the space sector as that I know of, but in other sectors that probably the space sector would get on board as well at some point. There are also robotics-related applications that's out there to be discussed for cleaning space debris, for instance, which is fundamental. And also, I would say for resilience purposes, I'm also looking a little bit on the quantum technology side of the issues, mostly on quantum communications and as well as quantum sensors and sensing technology. Of course, the quantum technology, we're not yet there, but what I'm trying to understand is, can we create a certain level of future-proof understanding on resilience by relying on these technologies, or would these technologies be a problem by themselves or not? So I would say in that regard, the new technologies, you need to do a risk assessment whether that emerging technology can create an opportunity or a risk.
Thanks, Beyza. With this slide, I mean, let's just look at this slide for a moment from our respondents here. This is super interesting. So what you guys are telling me is that there are already sorts of hacks of satellites going on, and there have been for some time. And 66% of our respondents think that a hack qualifies as an attack on a satellite. Very few of them say it doesn't, and we've got about a third of people who are kind of undecided. So that's kind of interesting because this is going on all the time, and it's pretty serious. We don't see states sort of reacting kind of in a way they would say if they had a ship or an airplane attack by somebody else. So it is interesting, isn't it? I mean, what do you guys make of this, Raji?
No, absolutely. I think the numbers I think are very, very interesting, and a clear demonstration of the fact that much of the strategic community believes that this is a serious problem and this is not going to go away. And I think that also sort of ties into the fact that an earlier question that you had put to Beyza, for instance, commercial actors, whether they are more vulnerable in a sense. I don't think they are more. I think that there is both yes and no. In one sense, I would say that private sector may have actually more stringent guidelines and best practices in play, and they may actually invest a great deal more in financial and technical terms to remove some of the vulnerabilities from hacking or any such kind of acts of cyber warfare. But at the same time, we are increasingly seeing a trend where private sector is launching satellites with mixed payloads and mixed stakeholderships and so on and so forth, which makes them equally vulnerable or even more in that sense. This may not be the case so much in Asia because most of the Asian states still have the states running their space programs, but it comes to a lot of Western countries, private sector has been an active player even in the security and military space programs in a sense, and therefore the vulnerability of the private sector in that sense is a lot more, I would think. But the cyber, whether it is hacking, jamming, all of those things are only going to go up because I think the given the current state of the play in terms of the major power relations and the changing balance of power dynamics at play, I would think the competition is only going to intensify. You will see a lot many more incidents in the coming years.
Thanks, Raji. Beyza, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I guess I guess so. So this is an interesting, I think, slide. I'm more focusing on the 32% of the maybes and the 3% no's than the 65% yeses. The 3% no's, it means that we couldn't convince them with our speech. But the maybes is really interesting because I think what they're saying is that it really depends on the hack itself. And I agree with that. So it's a yes and a maybe at the same time, I would say. Some hack, for instance, is like traditional espionage type activities. Do you qualify them as an attack? You know, how can you qualify something as an attack if it did not have, let's say, any kind of cause of injury or a death, or it didn't damage any infrastructure, it didn't cause any damage in any place? So it's really hard question in that sense. In that small question, you were asking a lot from the audience. Coming back to your question, is like, what is cyber attack? And I didn't actually fairly like give the definition to you. There is actually a definition that the Tallinn manual makes. And that definition, I think, would answer your question in here as well. The Tallinn manual says that a cyber attack is kind of an attack as a type of operation in a way. And it could be defensive or offensive in nature. But then in that operation, it should either cause an injury or a death to a person, or it should cause damage or destruction to the objects. And I think that's important to qualify. Thanks, John.
Thanks, Beyza. I think that's a really useful point, and maybe we should have rephrased our question somewhat and said, you know, if a hack causes physical damage or destruction to a satellite, is it an attack or something like that? And I guess that would be an interesting question to answer another time. We've got a lot of questions coming in, and there isn't going to be time to answer many more of them, but quite a few of these questions seem to be about the sorts of kind of responses of what do you do about this? And Raji, in the UNIDIR space dossier that you wrote for us last year, you noted that existing multilateral regulatory frameworks seem to be insufficient to cope with the threat to space systems posed by both cyber and electronic capabilities. And you said that new measures defining norms of behavior and rules of engagement with this tech are required. So what would be some possible ways forward in your view? I mean, would they be transparency measures or something else? Where could these kind of things be pursued? I noticed, for instance, we've had a question from someone in Venezuela asking kind of about those sorts of issues. And Beyza, for you, I sort of wondered, in view of your thinking about NATO and sort of some of the alliance and the arms racing dimensions of this, because of course NATO has a big interest in this. The leading space powers include the US and China and Russia and India. What are the sorts of things that we might envisage kind of those states agreeing on, to try to reduce this problem, but at a time where there's quite a lot of strategic tension and competition, rivalry amongst them. So these are big questions. I know maybe you both quickly want to take a shot at that. Raji, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, John. I think it's absolutely clear. I think anyone who's been working in this domain would know how contentious the debate has become in terms of when it comes to the global governance of outer space and the new challenges, new and emerging challenges. How do we deal with them? You have had some of the very good comprehensive measures like the Outer Space Treaty, but there are certain important gaps, which is that, for instance, Outer Space Treaty does not ban the weapons other than weapons of mass destruction. It does not prohibit states from placing weapons in outer space. So conventional weapons or any other weapons. So in a sense, states have also come around to interpreting this in a very, very broader fashion to say that non-W weapons placement is not violation of any of their commitments. So I think we are reaching a very, very dangerous turn with those kind of expansionists or a very broad-based debate in a sense. But I think so we need to find very innovative ways to deal with this particular new sets of challenges, whether it is electronic, cyber warfare, and also other types of challenges that are coming about. I think one of the first ways to recognize is that states have ultimately the responsibility when it comes to any challenges, any sort of attacks that stem from within their territory. And I think one of the best ways to kind of tackle this particular aspect is to look at the UN Security Council Resolution 1540, which is a good measure. And I would say that it might be a good, useful thing to look at in the context of cyber warfare as well, because it mandates each state to control the actions of citizens and individuals within its borders. Because cyber is a domain where individuals can hack or jam a particular satellites and so on and so forth. And states can come out and say, oh, we don't have any control over this particular he's not a state entity, he or she is not a state entity. It's just an individual. But I think here is where I think mechanisms like the UN Security Council Resolution 1540 can also be looked at as a model to kind of develop something along those lines for cyber means. It's also important to kind of look at where do you debate some of these issues, because traditionally we have discussed security and strategic aspects of outer space within the CD, the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva. But given the state of the affairs, a stalemate situation for more than 2 decades, that's not really going to take us very far. So again, we need to look at other options. UN Disarmament Commission could be one, where we could get the process of introducing future possible regulations, and that could hopefully lead to better understanding, more policy convergence at a slightly later date. But again, I have my suspicions about how things might pan out there, because given the recent conduct of the UNDC in the last couple of years, the prospects of effective deliberations are slim. But I would say that we need to try all the different avenues. And again, if at all we get to the UNDC and other such platforms to debate some of these questions, I think there are ways to take, there's a broader way to look at cyber electronic warfare under one basket, and or otherwise follow a much narrower approach to define, for instance, define what an armed attack against outer space object is all about, the requirements for verification and monitoring mechanism in a future instrument, uh, or even a mapping exercise to identify the national technical capabilities and means to avail means for verification and monitoring. In this regard, the UNIDIR has an excellent paper to look at, but I think these are some of the ways to kind of get the debate started. This is not going to be easy. And once you have these debates done at the UN Disarmament Commission level, you can take them later to the UN General Assembly First Committee or the UN Security Council for further action. But I wouldn't say that any of these are going to be easy, especially in the last few years. We have seen how even some of the multilateral processes, such as the UN group of government experts initiatives, have suffered in that sense. Sort of the inability of the major powers to come together to or develop consensus on some of the critical issues have been a major impediment in creating sort of future pathways. But we need to try every possible avenue and every possible initiative. There is a group of states which believe that voluntary mechanisms are the best way, given the current contentious nature of interstate relations. But there is another group of states which believe that TCBMs, or transparency and confidence building measures, are only good supplementary measures, but it cannot replace the importance of legal instruments. But we need to find a midway. And I believe there was even a debate about having legally binding TCBMs, and that might be something for us to look in terms of further taking that process forward. Thank you, John.
Right. Thanks, Raji. I think that's really useful. And, it is interesting in bodies like the Conference on Disarmament and their discussions on PAROS, or the prevention of an arms race in outer space. It's interesting, isn't it? There's a chicken and egg problem that they've been talking about PAROS and the importance of it 40 years or more, but then they don't negotiate any legally binding agreements because they have these very, very different conceptions of what PAROS is, whether you're, for example, a Western country, or whether you're from another part of the world. And I guess today's strategic environment, in which you're seeing more and more rivalry, in particular between the United States and Russia and China, I guess this is complicating things. And in that sense, really over to you, Beyza, for your thoughts on those sort of other things that might be possible.
I think it links really well with the question, your question on NATO and the arms race, and how NATO countries should be thinking about these issues. And I think one of the challenges on that is the legal challenges. What is really allowed in space for NATO and its member states needs to be kind of agreed from their end as well, and it needs to really fit into the international law and the norms that exist in this space already. And when you have 30 member states, it's really hard to get an agreement on these things. So I think that's going to be an important point of reference that we need to be tackling in the next round. As you know, space became a policy, as a space policy within NATO, and it's an operational domain right now, as cyber, air, and land and maritime domain is. It's the same way that NATO is seeing it. There are certain elements, I think, that they will still continue to work on. For instance, they need to focus on the acquisition policies that needs to be sorted out. They need to focus on enhancing resilience requirements. They need to focus on the baseline requirements or best practices. There are also, of course, considerations that needs to be done on interoperability of the forces, because NATO forces rely on space assets, and that really links to the interoperability of them. And I think in the next 3-4 years or so, these are the focus areas that the NATO member states are going to be working more on. Thanks, John.
Thanks very much, Beyza. I think that's really interesting. And one of the questions that we had today, I'm not sure we have time to answer it, but somebody was asking, you know, and it relates back to, I guess, what you were saying about resilience. You know, what if there was a cyber attack that knocked out the global positioning system, for instance, all around the world? You know, at one level that's a military system, but at another it's a very widely used civilian system. And if you suddenly knock that out, that could have quite a humanitarian cost, I suppose. You know, because it's so widely used for navigation and all sorts of other functions in the modern age. I guess it goes back to the kind of question that you guys were discussing before, which, you know, is what really constitutes a cyber attack? What is that threshold? And that does seem to be quite a key question. But what I'd like to do now is to go, if our producers can bring up the next question that we have for our audience, who hopefully have been absorbing and digesting everything that you've been saying today. So what can be done to make space-based systems more secure? You guys have thrown out some ideas, and it'd be kind of interesting to see what our audience think too. So hopefully people will find their multimedia viewer, and then they will start putting their answers in, and we can start populating this slide and seeing what people are thinking out there. I see precisely one new idea: increase understanding among stakeholders. How do you think that can be done? Do you have ideas, guys?
How this can be done? So one of the points that's raised is. Go ahead, John. Sorry.
No, up to you.
So one of the points that's been raised actually is on the standards, and it's an area that we've been focusing on as well. And I know that there are some commercial work that's going on with regards to standards. Can we think about space standards just the same way as we were thinking about cyber standards, and it's like cyberspace standards? And we have been doing some work on that, and I think it would be a good way of thinking about how to make it more secure, how to make the space-based systems more secure. So that's a really good idea. There was a comment on the GPS and GNSS systems. So if you want to make something more secure or more reliable, more resilient, I think there are a few characteristics that you need. One thing that you need is the system to be robust. The other thing that you would need is redundancy in the system. So if it is only the GPS, GNSS that we're relying on, and at NATO at the moment we do, then you need to think about alternative PNT applications that could be applied in operations. For communications, for instance, I saw a question that came out on 5G, for instance, is it would it create vulnerability or so on? I look at it on the other way. Can 5G actually would be helpful? Because the communication systems today relies on two things: either the ground segment information or from the space segment. But 5G can actually create decentralized communication networks for military operations. So we need to think about redundancy. I think that's really key on making space-based systems more secure. The last thing I would point out is that when you're thinking about redundancy, when it comes to cyber, you also need to think about not to copy paste the same software that has the same bugs to the next redundant system, because while you're thinking that you create redundancy, what you end up doing is actually repeating the vulnerability in the redundant system. So designing it from the designing stage is really important to consider cybersecurity. Raji, do you want to add anything else?
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point. And one first on the number of stakeholders and how do you get them to. I think that's an interesting dynamic that I think that's been and the part of the conversation in some ways in the outer space domain. But I think how willing are states, in a sense, to engage, for instance, the private sector. Private sector has, they do come up with security standards, they do come up with various protocols as part, because they are making significant financial and technology investment. So they want to make sure that their technology is, the vulnerabilities to those technologies are removed in a sense. But at the same time, to make them an active stakeholder in when it comes to developing norms of responsible behavior, or norms of, or even have them as an active stakeholder in the room. I think that's you are still seeing some resistance when it comes to private sector engagement, and I think that's part of the problem in a sense. And I'm not, cyber may be slightly different, but I think when it comes to outer space, is somewhat which is somewhat more of a traditional sector in that sense. So you are seeing a lot more state engagement, government to government engagement as the principal driver of the governance debates. But I would argue for a bigger role for the private sector, because that can change the dynamics in some sense. The other aspect is, I think we need to call out irresponsible behavior. And I think that's where, for instance, there have been a lot of debates whether a code of conduct, for instance, whether they change the behavior of a particular state. It does not. It does not guarantee good behavior from states. But at the same time, if you endorse a code of conduct, it does bring in certain amount of peer pressure onto you to, to adhere to certain standards, to certain behavior, certain responsible behavior. And therefore, and when you see there is a bad behavior, there's been an attack or so on and so forth conducted by, coming from a particular state, I think we need to call out irresponsible behavior, bad behavior, and so on and so forth. So I think there are issues that we need to deal with. But I think my larger point is to have an expanded stakeholder base, so that there are the number of people who have a stake in ensuring the global governance go to reach some progress is that many more. And I think that is the only way to, and I think the private sector should be given a greater say.
Thanks, Raji. I think that's really important, and thanks to both you and to Beyza. And it seems to me, I mean, there are a lot of interesting answers coming through on the slide, but one point that seems relevant to me is that, you know, in space, it also means protagonists, the major protagonists, thinking through some of the stakes of, you know, these sorts of attacks and their potential consequences, and focusing on areas of cooperation where there are these sort of tragedy of the commons situations that should be avoided. Because it seems to me resilience works to a degree, but if you have cyber attacks that cause satellites to slam into each other and cause loads of debris, then everybody loses. So, you know, there must be areas of cooperation where, you know, that would be possible. And also, you know, trying to head off wasteful arms racing where there's a massive offense, defense, balance, or deterrence type solutions. What we're going to do now is we're going to wrap up, because it's been almost an hour. But I really want to thank our two presenters today, Raji Rajagopalan and Beyza Unal. I think you've been fantastic panelists. I really want to thank you. I hope our audience has enjoyed the session today. I really am sorry that we couldn't take more than a few of your questions, but loads of interesting stuff there. And I really encourage you to read the Raji's paper and to read Beyza's work in this area as well. I think there's a lot of good food for thought there. We'll be sending out evaluation forms, as I mentioned, by email over the next day or two. Please fill these in. It helps us improve, helps us learn how we can deliver on what you out there want to learn about. And I would also invite you to join us next Wednesday for episode 3 at the same time of the Launchpad seminars. It's going to be on rockets, missiles, and space, lessons from the Hague Code of Conduct and beyond. So I think that's going to be really an interesting meeting. And I also want to, as well as thanking our presenters, I'd like to thank the many people behind the scenes who are working on this event. It is actually a huge amount of work, believe it or not, to do an event like this, particularly on a platform like WebEx. So thanks to our colleagues at Rees McCann who helped to produce this event, and also my colleagues at UNIDIR, in particular Daniel Porras and Letitia Zarkan, who have done a huge amount of work behind the scenes. So there on the slide, you can see the information about our next seminars. I really want to thank you once again, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
from us, goodbye.
Thank you, John.
John, thank you.